Well, hello there. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Lore channel. This video is the fifth of a 15-part series. The series is entitled Fundamentals of Finance and Bitcoin. This fifth part is entitled The Wealth Blueprint. The hook of this video is that most people think that they own assets, but in reality they own expenses. And the takeaway is that wealth is equal to assets minus liabilities over the course of time. So without further ado, let's get started. The Bitcoin lore makes the claim that we, that is to say, the people behind the Bitcoin lore and these videos that we're making, bring to the table two differentiating ideas that separate us from a crowd of other Bitcoin teachings and services. And if you've seen our previous videos and our channel video, our YouTube channel video of the Bitcoin lore, then you would know that we focus on not only Bitcoin, but also critical thinking as applied to Bitcoin and emotional intelligence as applied to Bitcoin. Those are two differentiating ideas. Now, talking about them is one thing. Figuring out what they mean is another thing. And then appropriating what we mean by critical thinking in general as applied to Bitcoin, as well as emotional intelligence in general, and again applied to Bitcoin. Also, critical thinking and emotional intelligence work together in an amazing way. So in this video, I'll be illustrating the appropriation, the understanding, and then forming into our character through asking questions, getting answers, and taking action, such that it will be obvious as time rolls along of what is meant by the critical thinking and emotional intelligence as applied to Bitcoin, but it could also be a universal truth in the sense of it being applied to all of life. After all, critical thinking is not only limited to the fundamentals of finance and Bitcoin, nor is emotional intelligence. Let's make some distinctions and set the stage for our talk today on assets and liabilities. We're going to use some average points in an imagined graph. So the first is, let's imagine a 25-year-old person and a 50-year-old person. If such a person lived to 100 years of age, then 25 is early in stage in life and 50 is somewhere in the middle. This will become important and obvious why we're using these particular numbers. Also, let's imagine love on the one hand as an emotion and an emotional intelligence, and then the opposite of it, which is a strong word, hate. Then we'll talk about not only 50 versus 25 or 25 versus 50, depending on which side of the spectrum you put them, love versus hate, but also courage along with love, and at the opposite end, fear that goes with hate. There's also taking action and doing, and then not taking action and not doing. Now, most of the time, this is the presupposition or what people have in the back of their minds as they're going through life, talking about things and just living life. But from a really technical standpoint and a nuanced standpoint in psychology, in sociology, in philosophy, in various sciences, there exists something in the middle that is not so easy to describe and explain with words. And that is somewhere in the middle. For example, between love and hate and courage and fear may be some type of neutral or a neutral-like emotion, which would be indifference. The equivalent of that in terms of action and not taking action is a subtle thing where psychologists, philosophers, sociologists, and other sciences and professors and pioneers in those respective areas have made distinctions like, for example, when you don't do something, you could purposely not do it. So in other words, between not taking action and taking action, not taking action is a form of taking action, as is being indifferent or not caring about a certain thing. This is really important to keep in mind as we describe a introductory understanding or a working understanding of the definitions of things like wealth and liabilities and assets. All right. Since assets are incorporated or part of assets are liabilities, in the plural or singular, it's almost always in the plural because there's a lot going on unless you isolate something. So let's talk about liabilities. Now, liabilities are something where if we have that 25 to 50-year-old and we have love on the one hand and hate on the other, courage on the one hand, fear on the other, and in the middle some kind of indifference of emotions, and at some point someone decides not to do something, which is a decision, but it may come off as though they're apathetic, but they're really not. So along this timeline, it's something where it's not static. It's something that's dynamic and changing, such that when liabilities are thought of, it can be something where they take time and they involve the loss of money. Two of the areas where that applies are cars and homes. Those are typically the biggest purchases that people make, especially middle-class people. That's what we're mainly talking about, as opposed to poor and wealthy, some type of vast majority middle class, so to speak. So then, when someone purchases a car or a home, they have to put down a down payment and get a mortgage. And so what happens is there's liabilities involved in that. It's not just debt. Debt in the form of, I've borrowed such and such amount, I'll pay it back in 10, 15, 30 years with interest. So there's debt, but there's also the maintenance of things, other areas where taxes are involved, property tax, having different kinds of earthquake, fire insurance, and also the maintenance of things. That's a part of liability that people don't always laser beam focus on, but it's a huge part of it. The wear and tear and the depreciation of the quality of a physical good as time passes. So liabilities, in a sense, real sense, drain money, whereas assets, thought of as something where compound interest based on the first principal amount paid for, they grow. Money is compounded with interest. People make various types of investments, anywhere from crypto to stocks and bonds to real estate to precious metals. Now, that compounding is basically an exponential engine that adds to the overall net worth of someone. So that every spending decision, strictly speaking, must be taken into account with this takeaway from the video, which is that wealth that we've talked about in terms of exchanging time, energy, never getting that time back, but capturing it in the form of a fiat currency. Fiat is by decree, because someone in authority said so, that paper, it's more than paper, but is worth a certain amount. So we've exchanged our time for fiat currency. Our energy and time was captured. We'll never get that back. Yet if we put it in a savings account or just hold on to it in a piggy bank, then what will happen is it'll go down in value because of the printing of money. We've talked about that. So that wealth and assets in particular, are the liabilities over time. And wealth itself, an asset minus the liability, and over a certain specific amount of time that is particular to each use case. One of the things that people don't realize is that deflation, which is a good thing, is built into the Bitcoin system. That is to say, when there's a halving, we're at the time of recording this video in approximately March to April of 2028 will be the next halving. Every time there's a halving, less Bitcoin is being issued per 10 minutes on the blockchain, such that that finite amount in that particular fifth of 33 halving cycles is deflationary. It automatically deflates. Now, if someone were to ask, well, what about gold? Well, the thing about gold is not really deflationary because people mine gold continuously. That is to say, there's a certain amount of gold in existence now, and at the same time, there's a certain amount of gold being mined physically, literally, not from a hardware and software standpoint like Bitcoin is, so that approximately 1 to 2% inflation occurs of gold. The deflationary aspect could be better understood in terms of a medium and the percentages. So we had a 25 and a 50-year-old, we had love and hate, we had courage and fear, and now we could talk about governments typically say there's a 1 to 2% inflation rate yearly. But on the average, realistically, independent economists say it's more like 7%, with an approximate adjustment average of 4% on the negative side and 4% on the positive side. That is to say, in any given year, in any given country, and globally, there's about a 7% interest of inflation. And when that's the case, it can be anywhere from 3 to 7%, that 4% adjustment, or 7 to 11%. This is really important because once people understand and they see how it plays out in the real world, that the accumulation of Bitcoin through self-custody from exchanges and then stored in a cold storage wallet, which we'll go into deep dives of what that means if you don't know already and how to go about doing that, part of the Bitcoin services that we offer, not just the teachings, such that the acquiring of fiat currency, getting paid for it, buying and selling of goods and service is kind of like a double whammy in a negative way. That is to say, the first part is inflation, the interest rate that's going up anywhere from 3 to 11%. So the purchasing power is going down. Simply put, as time passes, when you buy things, they cost more. But also, when someone keeps those things, depending on what it is, there's always exceptions. That is to say, there's a saying that extremely wealthy people can't spend themselves into poverty. That might be a new insight for you, or it might not. Which is to say, buying expensive homes and jewelry, watches, cars, when they're well built, they don't go down in price. They go up in price. But for the middle class, and definitely for the poor, things that are purchased are typically purchased with a down payment, with borrowed money, putting something as collateral so that people, middle class people, wind up being working poor because they have to pay back with interest on a luxury item that they, strictly speaking, don't have the money to be able to afford. So their purchasing power has gone down, and also the interest that they paid on the money that they borrowed, that they will pay back, is also becoming more and more expensive. I hope you understand that concept. Whereas with Bitcoin, because of the finite amount and the deflationary dynamics built into it, Bitcoin continues to go up in value, not only in terms of using some type of fiat system like the US dollar or the British pound as a unit of account to measure Bitcoin, but at some point in time, the belief is that not only will Bitcoin be, which it already is, a store of value and a medium of exchange, but also it will become that unit of measurement where globally, as a strategic reserve, it will be used as the unit of measurement relative to other things, not other things relative to this fiat currency versus that, and pricing Bitcoin. Now, having said that, let's bring it all together in terms of why we said certain things. Like, we gave an example of a 25-year-old and a 50-year-old. Now, common sense would tell you if that 50-year-old had a net worth of 2 million US dollars, one would think that that person is a multimillionaire. Whereas a 25-year-old getting a master's or a PhD coming out of school has zero net worth, is in a worse position. But that's not necessarily the case, because if you have to take into the account, into the situation, what we're talking about, how wealth is defined. If wealth is defined as assets, Bitcoin asset versus fiat currency minus liabilities, which with Bitcoin, there is not the same type of liability as there is with money, because Bitcoin is deflationary versus inflationary. Bitcoin has no top because fiat currency going down and being endlessly printed probably has no bottom. So that when these fiat currencies and these central banks, and the headquarters of it would be, of course, in Switzerland, when they issue these types of debt-based system fiat currencies, it's not done out of love. It's done out of fear, and there's typically hatred toward people that do that because they realize that their life savings are being inflated away, being debased. Versus something like Bitcoin, typically fans of it that can even become fanatical about it and become Bitcoin maximalists, Bitcoiners, it's believed to have been created with love. And that's the part where I've spoken about in the past, where it's not just mindsets and skill set, but there's that X factor to Bitcoin that some people are able to believe to be true, and such the case where Bitcoin was built from a base of love, and therefore people can be courageous when they're purchasing Bitcoin and self-custodying it and hodling it, holding on for dear life, so to speak, figuratively speaking, such that it will go up in value and be life-changing money. Whereas with fiat currency, a debt-based system where multiple trillions of various kinds of fiat currencies are involved, these debts can never be paid back. The fiat currency is created out of nothing, and it's debt-based, such that if someone gives a certain amount as a down payment and then they owe a certain amount, that money that they owe is created out of nothing, and that's what's meant There's more complexity to it, but a debt-based system. Where people make the mistake, the biggest mistake, is not taking into account this quasi-middle kind of Twilight Zone-y place of indifference, not having love or hate, or not taking action and thinking that they could exist in some type of void or vortex or some twisting neither somewhere. But there is no such thing. Because in economics, in finance, in money, and in life, people have to, even if they're asleep when they wake up, they have to have active goals and an active plan, because the way that this wealth blueprint system works with assets and liabilities is that even the smallest amount of liability, money that's owed in debt, having a car, property, whatever the case may be, even a person's physical body, it involves putting in time that could have otherwise be spent somewhere else, and putting in the money that's involved to maintain and keep up the quality of the working order of various things. To conclude this video, what we've done is talked about critical thinking and emotional intelligence. We gave some examples, hypothetical scenarios. We talked about averages and above and below averages. We also talked about nuanced things where sometimes it's not just this color or that color, but various shades, figuratively speaking, of being indifferent. Also, we talked about this idea of being neutral and being at some point where there's no, figuratively speaking, something that's set in motion. And we've made the claim that in the world of finance and in life, there's really no such thing. So a person needs to be very proactive in acquiring assets, maintaining them, and trying to think of every decision that's made and the long-term consequences of those decisions, especially as it relates to the compounding and the cumulative effect of the liabilities that exist, that maybe not in the present, but looking at the younger someone is, a 25-year-old versus a 50-year-old. 25-year-old may have some debt and no net worth, but can be in a strategically greater position for future prosperity than someone who, again, hypothetically is around 50, who has a lot of debt, who doesn't understand the nuances of the things that we're talking about in terms of traditional finance and its vast inferiority to something like Bitcoin and the way that it works. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you and goodbye.